I thought the smell of industrial bleach would be enough to drown out the memory of her. I was wrong. 6 months. That is how long I have been running. 6 months since I walked out of the Sterling estate with nothing but the clothes on my back and a heart that felt like it had been shredded by 1,000 silk ribbons. I thought I had vanished. I thought I was just another ghost in a city of millions. This place is called the Haven. It is a women's shelter on the edge of the industrial district. The walls are thin, the soup is watery, and the cots creak like dying animals. But it was mine. Or so I thought. "Ilara, you're doing it again," Martha said. She's the director here, a beater with hands that always smell of lavender and hope. She was looking at me with that pity I hate. "You're staring at the door like you're waiting for the wolf to come knocking." "I'm just tired, Martha," I whispered. My voice sounded like dry leaves. The truth is, my body was failing. Without the scent of an alpha, an omega like me starts to fray. My skin felt too tight. My senses were dialed to a frequency of pure terror. And the heat, it was coming back. A slow, agonizing burn in my marrow that I couldn't ignore anymore. "Well, don't be tired yet," Martha smiled. "The Guardian just sent another wire. We can afford the new suppressants. The good ones. The ones that actually work." The Guardian. That is the name we gave the anonymous donor. For 4 months, this person has been our lifeline. New heaters. Fresh blankets. Medical supplies. To the other women, the Guardian is a saint. An angel without a face. But to me, the Guardian was a question I was too afraid to answer. I hated that my life depended on a stranger's gold. I had spent 3 years as a trophy in Serafina Sterling's collection. I didn't want to be a debt on someone else's ledger. I went to the basement to sort the new arrivals. I needed to move. If I stayed still, I could feel the ghost of Serafina's fingers on my neck. I could hear her voice, that deep, commanding velvet, telling me to stay. I had stayed until the love became a cage. Serafina didn't just love me. She curated me. She was the alpha of this city, a woman who owned the skyline. When she looked at me, I felt like the sun. But the sun burns everything it touches. The basement was cold. I opened a box of high-end donations. Silk dresses. Cashmere coats. Items that didn't belong in a place like this. I reached in and my heart stopped. A charcoal grey scarf. I didn't need to look at the label. I brought it to my nose. Cedarwood. Rain. Power. I dropped it like it was a snake. It was impossible. She didn't donate. She bought. She sold. She destroyed. "Ilara, you okay?" Chloe, a young girl, asked. "I'm fine," I lied. Chloe took the scarf. "It's so soft," she whispered. I let her take it. I wanted it gone. But you can't forget the storm when you're living in the eye of it. Later that night, the world changed. The sound started first, the deep, rhythmic pulse of heavy engines. Not the police. Not the city. Private security. Black SUVs lined the curb like predators. I knew those cars. I knew the way the air shifted when they arrived. I tried to run for the fire escape, but Martha caught me. "Ilara, stay back. The Guardian is here. She says the sector isn't safe. She's coming inside." The Guardian. My blood turned to ice. The giver. The saint. The front door opened. And then, the wave hit me. A tidal wave of alpha pheromones. Cedarwood. Rain. Dominance. Serafina Sterling stepped into the hall. She looked perfect. Black coat. Silver hair. Eyes like flint. She didn't look like a donor. She looked like a hunter who had finally cornered her prey. Martha bowed. "Ms. Sterling, we didn't know." Serafina didn't even blink. Her eyes scanned the room, moving past the other women like they were furniture. Then, her gaze locked onto the stairs. Locked onto me. "Investments require oversight, Martha," Serafina said. Her voice turned my bones to water. "I don't like it when my property is left out in the cold." She started up the stairs. Each step was a drumbeat. My inner omega was screaming, terrified and desperate to surrender all at once. I turned and bolted. I hit the fire door, bursting into the freezing rain. I scrambled down the metal steps, but at the bottom, 2 enforcers stood waiting. I was trapped. The door above me opened. The air itself seemed to bow in her presence. Running again, Ilara. Serafina's voice was like velvet over gravel. You always were so dramatic. I couldn't breathe. She stepped onto the platform, her heels clicking on the iron. She looked at me with a terrifying satisfaction. You look thin. They haven't been using my funds for your meals, clearly. You were the guardian, I whispered. All this time. The money. The meds. It was you. Did you think anyone else cared if you lived or died? She stepped into my space. The scent of her was a physical weight. I knew you were here the moment you checked in. I just wanted to see how long you could survive without me. You let me suffer, I spat. You watched me freeze just to prove a point. I didn't watch you freeze, Ilara. I paid for every meal you ate. I paid for the heat. I even paid for the suppressants that kept your scent hidden from everyone. The rain felt like needles against my skin as Serafina pulled me flush against her chest. Her arm was a warm, unyielding band around my waist. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body had already surrendered. The scent of her, thick cedarwood and the electric charge of a storm, flooded my senses, silencing the panic in my mind with a primal, terrifying relief. My inner Omega wasn't afraid. It was purring. It was home. Get her to the car, Serafina commanded. Her voice didn't even ripple with the wind. It was the calm, terrifying tone of a queen reclaiming a lost jewel. 2 men in black suits moved in. They didn't touch me roughly, but the efficiency of their movements told me I had no choice. I was led down the iron stairs, my legs shaking so hard I nearly tripped. The black SUV waited at the curb, its engine a low, predatory growl. The interior was a cocoon of cream leather and that same overwhelming scent. It was a smell I once associated with safety. Now, it smelled like the end of the world. As the car pulled away, I watched the haven vanish into the grey mist. I saw Martha standing in the doorway, her hands clutching her apron. She looked stunned. She didn't know her saint was a predator. She didn't know she had inadvertently sold my location for a new heating system and a box of suppressants. Don't look back, Ilara, Serafina said. She sat next to me, not touching me, yet her presence filled every cubic inch of the car. That place was never for you. You were a diamond sitting in a pile of industrial waste. It was only a matter of time before I polished you back into shape. You lied to them, I whispered. My voice was a ghost of itself. You played with their lives just to trap me. I saved them, she corrected, her golden eyes flashing in the dim light. Without my donations, that roof would have collapsed 2 months ago. I gave them security. In return, they unknowingly gave me you. It was a fair trade. I always pay my debts, Ilara. And I always collect what is owed to me. The drive was short. The tall, wrought iron gates of the Sterling estate opened like a mouth. The house sat on the hill, a fortress of glass and marble, glowing against the dark sky. This was the place where I had been a queen, and the place where I had been a pet. Inside, the air was pressurized with wealth. The servants bowed as we entered, their faces masks of professional indifference. They didn't look at my tattered coat or my messy hair. To them, I was just a runaway piece of furniture that had been returned to its proper room. Take her to the master suite, Serafina told the head maid. And burn those clothes. I want the smell of the city scrubbed off her skin. I was led up the grand staircase. My old room, our room, was exactly as I had left it. The silk sheets were a deep, bruised purple. The fireplace was already crackling. I stood in the center of the room and felt the walls closing in. The silence was heavier than the noise of the shelter. In the shelter, I was hungry, but I was Ilara. Here, I was just a sterling asset. The bath was drawn. The water was hot and smelled of expensive oils. I stayed under until my lungs burned, trying to wash away the feeling of her thumb on my jaw. But as the heat of the water soaked into my skin, it triggered something else. A low, rhythmic ache in my pelvis. A thickening in my blood. The heat. It was no longer a threat, it was a reality. My system, finally reunited with its alpha, was accelerating. I dressed in a silk robe the color of a fresh wound. I didn't want to leave the bathroom, but the door opened before I could lock it. Serafina stood there. She had removed her coat, her white silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar. She looked at me, and I felt like a piece of glass under a microscope. "You look thin," she said, her voice dropping to a low vibration. "I will have the chef prepare something rich. I want you strong for what comes next." "Why do you want me back?" I bit out, my voice trembling with a mix of rage and rising arousal. "You have everything. Why hunt me for 6 months?" "Because you were the only thing in this city I didn't own completely," she said, stepping into my space. She took a lock of my damp hair and inhaled deeply. "I enjoy the hunt, Ilara. But I enjoy the kill much more." She leaned in, her lips brushing the shell of my ear. "The suppressants you took at the shelter. I made sure they were the low-grade ones. They didn't stop your cycle, they just slowed it down so I could time your return perfectly." My heart stopped. The Guardian's gifts. The meds Martha praised. They were a timer. A biological trap. "You're a monster," I gasped. "I'm an alpha," she purred. "And you are mine. Now, eat. Sleep. Tomorrow, the real work begins." She left, locking the door from the outside. I collapsed onto the bed. The silk felt like water. I looked at the window, and for the first time, I saw the new steel bars disguised as decorative scrollwork. I was back in the cage. And this time, I had helped build it. I knew the dark truth of my fate within the walls of her cold estate, and I was lost. I knew the dark truth of my fate within. The fire didn't start in the hearth. It started in my marrow. By the time the moon was high over the Sterling estate, my skin felt like it was made of live wires. Every brush of the silk sheets against my legs was a jolt of electricity. I was drowning in my own biology, a prisoner of a cycle I had tried so hard to break. The scent in the room had changed. It was no longer just the smell of expensive oils and old money. It was me. Vanilla and honey, but sour with the sharp tang of distress. I was nesting, but there was nothing to nest with. I had shredded the silk pillows, trying to make a wall between me and the door, but the fabric was too smooth, too cold. It didn't smell like safety. It smelled like her. A soft click echoed in the silence. The lock. I scrambled to the corner of the bed, pulling the duvet to my chin. My breath was coming in ragged gasps. Serafina stepped into the room. She had changed into a black silk robe that flowed around her like liquid shadow. She didn't look like the CEO now. She didn't look like the Guardian. She looked like a predator who had finally found the heart of the maze. "Stay back," I rasped. My voice was a wreck. "You're shaking, Ilara," she said. Her voice was a low, resonant hum that vibrated right through the floorboards and into my bones. She didn't stay back. She walked to the edge of the bed, her movements slow and deliberate. The heat is a powerful thing. It strips away the lies we tell ourselves. It leaves only the truth. "The truth is that you trapped me." I shouted, but it came out as a whimper. "The truth," she said, sitting on the edge of the mattress, "is that you are starving. And I am the only one who can feed you." She reached out. I tried to flinch, but my body leaned into her hand before my mind could stop it. Her fingers were cool against my burning cheek. The contact was like a bucket of ice water in a desert. I let out a broken sob, my eyes fluttering shut. I hated myself for how much I needed her touch. "Look at me," she commanded. I opened my eyes. Her golden irises were wide, the pupils blown out with her own rising alpha instincts. She was affected too. For all her talk of control and property, the bond, the one she had refused to seal for 3 years, was pulling at her just as hard. "Why didn't you mark me?" I asked, the question I had carried like a stone for years finally breaking loose. "You had 3 years. You kept me as a pet, but you never made me yours. Why now?" Serafina's hand stilled. For a split second, the mask of the cold alpha slipped. I saw a flash of something raw. Something that looked like fear. "Because a mark is a tether for both of us, Ilara," she whispered. "If I marked you, I would belong to you as much as you belong to me. I thought I could own you without the chains. I was wrong. When you left, the silence in this house was louder than any storm. I realized then that a cage is empty if the bird isn't singing. It was the first time I had ever heard her admit a weakness. The great Serafina Sterling, humbled by a runaway Omega. You didn't want a mate, I said, my heart hammering. You wanted a mirror. I wanted you, she said, her voice growling deep in her chest. She moved closer, her scent flaring, cedarwood, rain, and a sudden, sweet note of desperation. And I will have you. Not as a pet. Not as a trophy. But as my bondmate. She leaned down, her nose brushing the scent gland at the base of my throat. I arched my neck, the instinct to bare my throat for her teeth overwhelming every bit of logic I had left. I could feel her canines grazing my skin. One bite. That was all it would take. One bite and the 6 months of running, the cold cots at the shelter, the fear of the dark, it would all be gone. I would be safe. I would be hers. Do it, I whispered. But she didn't bite. She pulled back, her eyes searching mine. No, she said. Not like this. Not while the heat is making the choice for you. I want you to choose me when you can still walk away. I want you to stay because you want the cage, not because you're too weak to fly. She stood up and walked to the door. She unlocked it. The gates are open, Ilara, she said, not looking back. The cars are gone. You can leave right now. You can go back to the shelter, back to the cold, back to being a ghost. Or you can stay here and let me be the alpha you deserve. She walked out, leaving the door wide open. I sat in the center of the bed, the fire in my blood screaming for her to come back. I looked at the open door. I looked at the dark hallway. The bars on the windows were still there, but the door was an invitation. I felt the weight of the last 6 months. The hunger. The loneliness. The way Martha looked at me with pity. And then I looked at the silk sheets, the warmth of the room, and the memory of Serafina's hand on my face. I stood up. My legs were weak, but I walked to the door. I looked down the long, empty hall. I could hear the rain outside, the same rain I had run through 6 months ago. I didn't run. The click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the quiet hall. I stood there, my hand still resting on the cold brass, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had done it. I had closed the door on the world and chosen the cage. But as I leaned my forehead against the dark wood, I realized it wasn't a cage anymore. It was a choice. I heard her footsteps. They weren't moving away. They had stopped just on the other side of the door. Ilara. Her voice was a low, jagged rasp. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just stood there, breathing in the scent of her that seeped through the cracks of the door. Cedarwood. Rain. And now, a fierce, burning need that made the air between us feel heavy and thick. Slowly, I turned the lock back. The door swung open. Serafina was standing there, her eyes glowing like molten gold in the shadows. She looked at me, her gaze sweeping over my flushed face and my trembling hands. She saw the choice I had made. The power dynamic shifted in that second. For 3 years, I had been the one waiting for her to decide my fate. Now, she was the one waiting for me. You stayed, she whispered. I'm tired of running, Serafina, I said, my voice finally finding its strength despite the fire in my blood. But if I stay, I don't stay as a pet. I don't stay as a secret. If you want me, you take all of me. The runaway. The girl who hated you. The girl who loves you. She didn't hesitate. She stepped back into the room and closed the door behind her, locking it herself this time. She moved toward me, her presence overwhelming, but I didn't back away. I met her halfway. I never wanted a secret, Ilara, she said, her hands coming up to cradle my face. Her palms were warm, her touch reverent. I was just too proud to admit that without you, the Sterling name meant nothing. The Guardian wasn't just a way to trap you. It was the only way I knew how to take care of you when I couldn't hold you. She leaned down, her forehead resting against mine. I spent months looking at the receipts for the shelter. I knew exactly which brand of tea you liked. I knew when you needed new blankets. I was obsessed with the details of your life because I had lost the heart of mine. The honesty of it broke the last of my defenses. The heat flared, a white-hot wave that made me gasp. I gripped the silk of her robe, pulling her closer. "Mark me," I pleaded. "Not because of the heat. Because I want the world to know I'm not running anymore." Serafina let out a low, guttural growl, a sound of pure alpha possession. She tilted my head back, her thumb tracing the line of my throat. Her eyes were dark with a hunger that was no longer about property. It was about partnership. "Always," she purred. She leaned in, her lips grazing the sensitive skin of my neck. I felt her teeth, sharp and ready. I didn't flinch. I arched my back, offering myself to her. When her canines finally pierced the skin, I didn't feel pain. I felt a surge of pure, blinding light. The bond snapped into place like a puzzle piece finally finding its home. The fire in my blood didn't go out, but it changed. It was no longer a lonely, agonizing burn. It was a shared flame. I could feel her through the link, her pride, her fierce protection, and a deep, aching love that she had spent years trying to hide. We spent the night in the center of the silk sheets, the storm outside a distant memory. For the first time, the Sterling estate didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a home. In the morning, the light was soft and grey. I woke up with my head on her chest, the steady rhythm of her heart the only sound in the room. I looked at the window. The decorative bars were still there, but as I watched the birds sitting on the ledge outside, I realized they weren't meant to keep me in. They were meant to keep the world out. Serafina stirred, her arm tightening around me. She pressed a kiss to the top of my head, her scent, now mingled permanently with mine, enveloping me. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice morning soft. "I was thinking about Martha," I said. "She's going to be so confused when the Guardian stops sending checks and starts sending invitations." Serafina chuckled, a rich sound that made my chest warm. "The checks won't stop, Ilara. The Haven is going to be the first of many Sterling foundations. I think you should be the one to run them." I looked up at her, surprised. "You want me to work? In the city?" "I want you to be the Alpha's mate," she said, her golden eyes bright with a new kind of respect. "And that means you have a legacy to build. No more hiding in the shadows. We build the future together." I leaned up and kissed her, a slow, lingering promise. The runaway Omega was gone. The pet was gone. In their place was something new. Something stronger. The rain had stopped. The sun was starting to break through the clouds, hitting the marble floors of the room. I looked at the mark on my neck in the mirror. It was a small, elegant scar, a reminder of the night the storm finally ended. I wasn't a trophy. I wasn't a secret. I was a Sterling. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I belonged. I knew the dark truth of my fate within the walls of her cold estate. The first time I stepped back into the Haven, I wasn't wearing a tattered coat or a look of desperation. I was wearing an emerald silk dress that felt like a second skin and a scent that announced my presence before I even crossed the threshold. The mark on my neck was hidden by a high collar, but the way I stood, shoulders back, chin high, told a story that everyone in the room could read. I wasn't the runaway anymore. I was the Alpha's mate. The silence that greeted me was heavy. The women I had slept beside on creaking cots were staring, their eyes wide with a mix of shock and something that felt uncomfortably like awe. I saw Chloe in the corner, still wearing that charcoal grey scarf. She looked like she wanted to run to me, but the two enforcers standing behind me made her hesitate. "Ilara." Martha stepped out from the office. She looked older than she had a week ago. Her hands were trembling as she wiped them on her apron. She looked at me, then at the men in suits, and then at the black SUV parked at the curb. "I'm here to talk about the renovation plans, Martha," I said. My voice was steady, a reflection of the strength Serafina had poured into me over the last few days. "The renovation?" Martha whispered. "The Guardian. She said you would be the one." "I am the Guardian now," I said, stepping forward. I took Martha's hands. They were cold, just like mine used to be. "Serafina Sterling is my mate. And this shelter is no longer just a place to hide. It's the foundation of something much bigger." I spent the afternoon walking through the halls I used to haunt as a ghost. I looked at the leaky ceilings and the drafty windows with a new set of eyes. I wasn't looking for a place to sleep. I was looking for a way to build a fortress. Serafina had given me a budget that could have bought the entire district, but more than that, she had given me her trust. But the world of alphas isn't all silk and promises. As I was leaving, a silver sedan pulled up next to my SUV. A woman stepped out. She was tall, blonde, and radiated a scent of sharp peppermint and ego. I recognized her from the society pages. Julianne Thorne, a rival alpha who had been trying to buy the industrial district for years. "So, the rumors are true," Julian said, her eyes raking over me with a sneer. Serafina really did pick up a stray. I thought she had better taste than to bring a shelter rat into the boardroom. The enforcers moved to step in front of me, but I raised a hand. I felt a flicker of the bond, a sudden, protective surge of heat from Serafina. She was listening. She was watching. "I'm not a stray, Julianne," I said, my voice dropping into that low, dangerous frequency I had learned from my mate. "I'm the woman who decided whether or not you get to build your high-rise on this block. And right now, I'm thinking a community park would look much better here." Julianne's eyes narrowed, her scent turning bitter. "You think you're special because you're wearing her clothes? You're just a temporary fix for her boredom. When she's done with you, you'll be right back on one of these cots." "If she's done with me," I said, stepping closer, "it won't be because I was weak. It will be because I built something she couldn't own. But you're just a shark in a pond that's already dry." I walked past her, the enforcers forming a wall behind me. I didn't look back until I was inside the car. My heart was racing, a mix of adrenaline and lingering fear. I looked at my hands. They weren't shaking. When I returned to the estate, Serafina was waiting in the library. She was standing by the window, a glass of dark wine in her hand. She turned as I entered, her golden eyes bright with an intensity that made my breath catch. "You handled Julian well," she said, her voice a low purr of pride. "You were listening," I noted. "I always listen when it comes to you, Ilara." She crossed the room, pulling me into her arms. The scent of her, cedar wood and rain, washed away the peppermint stench of Julianne. "You're learning how to use your teeth." "I don't want to be a shark, Serafina," I whispered, leaning into her chest. "I just want to make sure they can't hurt the others." "You won't have to be a shark," she said, kissing the mark on my neck. "Because you have the biggest predator in the city at your back. But I like seeing you fight. It reminds me why I couldn't let you go." She led me to the desk, where a stack of legal documents waited. "The first deed is ready. The haven is yours, legally and financially. You are the director now." I looked at the papers. My name, Ilara Sterling, was printed in bold black ink. It was a name I hadn't yet grown into, but as I felt the steady, protective thrum of our bond, I realized I didn't have to do it alone. But as I reached for the pen, a shadow crossed the room. A knock at the door, urgent and sharp. The head of security entered, his face pale. "Ms. Sterling," he said. "There's a problem. The board of directors has called an emergency session. They're challenging your right to use corporate funds for the foundations. They're calling it a misuse of assets." Serafina's jaw tightened, her eyes turning to ice. "Julianne," she hissed. "They're not just challenging the funds," the man continued, his voice dropping. "They're questioning the validity of the bond. They're calling for a public verification." I froze. A public. The council chamber was a cathedral of glass and cold, grey stone. It sat at the very top of the city's highest tower, a place where laws were made by those who owned the air. As I walked beside Serafina, the sound of our footsteps echoed like heartbeats against the marble. I was wearing a suit of deep charcoal, the colour of the Sterling legacy, but my throat was bared. The mark she had given me, the small, raised scar that pulsed with her heartbeat, was my only armour. The air in the room was thick with the scent of competing alphas. Peppermint, sandalwood, old leather, and bitter spices. It was a suffocating wall of dominance designed to crush anyone who didn't belong. I felt the familiar spike of panic, the old urge to lower my gaze and disappear. But then, Serafina reached out. She didn't take my hand. She simply brushed her knuckles against mine, A momentary contact that flooded our bond with a surge of white-hot protective fire. Stay, her voice echoed in my mind, but this time it wasn't a command to remain in a cage. It was a call to stand my ground. Ms. Sterling, a voice boomed from the high dais. It was Arthur Vance, the oldest alpha on the board, a man whose skin looked like parchment and whose eyes were like cold ink. You have called this session to defend your recent, charitable diversions, and to present this Omega as your bonded mate. I am not here to defend anything, Arthur, Serafina said. Her voice was a blade of ice that sliced through the heavy pheromones in the room. She stood in the center of the chamber, feet braced, looking every bit the queen who owned the skyline. I'm here to introduce my partner, and to inform you that the Sterling Foundations are now a permanent fixture of our corporate structure. A ripple of low growls and whispers went through the room. Julianne Thorne sat in the front row, a smirk playing on her lips. She looked at me as if I were a smudge on a clean window. Verification is a sacred tradition, Julian said, standing up. We do not accept the word of an alpha whose judgment has been clouded by a runaway. We require proof. A sensory scan. We want to see the link for ourselves. A sensory scan meant letting a neutral beta, a reader, into the most private corners of our bond. It meant exposing every fear, every moment of heat, and every secret we shared. I felt my stomach turn. I looked at Serafina. Her jaw was tight, her eyes burning with a silent rage. She hated this. She hated that they were treating us like a lab experiment. Proceed, Serafina said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The reader was a small man with eyes that seemed to see right through my skin. He stepped into the circle, holding a crystal device that hummed with a low frequency. He placed his hands on the air between us, not touching us, but bridging the gap with his own subgender sensitivity. Open the link, the reader whispered. I closed my eyes. I reached out for the thread of cedar wood and rain that anchored me to the world. I let down the walls I had spent 6 months building. I let him in. The room vanished. I was back in the library at the estate. I was back on the fire escape in the rain. I was back in the center of the silk sheets, feeling the first, blinding light of the mark. But it wasn't just my memories. I felt hers too. I felt the crushing weight of the Sterling name. I felt the 6 months of silence in the house that had driven her to the brink of madness. I felt the moment she found my name on the intake list for the Haven and the agonizing restraint it took for her not to come for me that very night. She had waited. She had funded the shelter. She had bought the medicines. She had loved me from the shadows because she was terrified that if she stepped into the light, I would vanish forever. The reader let out a sharp, choked gasp. He pulled back, his hands shaking. The crystal device in his hand shattered, the fragments falling to the floor like diamonds. The chamber fell into a deafening silence. Even Julianne Thorne looked stunned. The scent of the room changed, the competing alphas were no longer growling. They were backing away, their own instincts recognizing a bond so powerful it was territorial. The link is absolute, the reader whispered, his voice trembling. It is not a strategy. It is a soul mark. I have never felt anything like it. Arthur Vance leaned forward, his ink-black eyes narrowing. A soul mark. That is a relic of the old world. It implies a total surrender of corporate autonomy. It implies, I said, stepping forward for the first time, my voice ringing out through the chamber, that you are no longer just dealing with Serafina Sterling. You are dealing with us. And we are not interested in your outdated traditions. I looked directly at Julianne. You wanted to see the runaway break. I'm sorry to disappoint you. The only thing breaking today is your hold on this city. Serafina turned to me, a look of pure, unadulterated adoration on her face. She reached out and finally took my hand, her fingers interlacing with mine. The heat of her palm was the only truth that mattered. The session is over, Serafina declared. We walked out of the chamber, the alphas parting for us like the sea before a storm. As we reached the elevator, the doors closing on the stunned faces of the board, Serafina pulled me into her arms. She buried her face in my neck, her breath warm against my mark. You were incredible, she. The drive back to the industrial district felt like a descent into a past I had buried under layers of silk and mountain cedar. My hands were knotted in the fabric of my suit, my knuckles white. A brother. I didn't have a brother. I had grown up in a state-run ward, a cold, grey building where omegas were treated like surplus parts. I was the only one who made it out. Or so I thought. You're radiating terror, Ilara, Serafina said. She hadn't let go of my hand since we left the council. Her thumb was tracing steady, soothing circles against my palm, but even her alpha strength couldn't quiet the screaming in my blood. I was alone, Serafina, I whispered. Before the estate, before you, there was no one. If this is him, if he's really back, then everything I told you about my past was a lie I didn't even know I was telling. The haven was surrounded by a different kind of silence today. The black SUVs of Serafina's detail were already there, their headlights cutting through the evening gloom. I stepped out of the car, the smell of rain and wet asphalt hitting me like a physical blow. Martha was standing by the entrance, her face pale. She pointed toward the small dining area. Sitting at one of the plastic tables was a man who looked like he had been dragged out of the city's darkest corner. He was thin, his clothes tattered, his eyes darting around with the frantic energy of a cornered animal. He looked up as I entered. For a second, the world tilted. He had my eyes. The same hazel, the same shape. But while mine were full of the sterling fire, his were hollow, filled with a desperate, hungry light. Ilara, he croaked. He stood up, his movements jerky. You actually came. I thought maybe you'd forgotten the gutter now that you're living in the clouds. Who are you? I asked, my voice barely audible. Leo, he said. He took a step forward, but the enforcers blocked his path. He let out a bitter laugh. Your big brother. Don't you remember the night the ward burned? You were 5. I was 7. I pushed you through the window first. I stayed behind to make sure the monitors didn't follow. A memory flashed in my mind, blinding, hot, and suffocating. Smoke. Someone screaming. A pair of hands shoving me into the cold night air. I had always thought it was a dream. I had always thought I was saved by luck. You're dead, I whispered. The record said everyone in that wing died. Records are easy to fake when an Omega is worth as much as a new car, Leo spat. He looked past me at Serafina, his eyes narrowing. And I see you found yourself a high-tier buyer. Is that what this is? You sold yourself to the sterling name to get out of the rain. Serafina stepped forward, her scent flaring, a sharp, warning growl of cedarwood and ice. Watch your tongue, Leo. You are speaking to my mate. And you are standing in her foundation. Leo didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, a jagged, terrifying expression. Mate. Is that what she tells you, Ilara? Or is it just another way to keep the property on a short leash? Because I have a message from the family you forgot you had. The debt you left behind in the ward didn't burn with the building. It's been growing. And now that you're a sterling, the interest is astronomical. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't a reunion. It was a shakedown. What debt? I asked. The ward was owned by a subsidiary of Thorn Acquisitions, Leo said, his eyes gleaming with a sick triumph. Julianne's father. When you escaped, you were considered a lost investment. And Julianne has been looking for a way to get back at Serafina for years. She didn't just find me, Ilara. She bought me. I'm her leverage. I looked at Serafina. Her face was a mask of stone, but I felt the tremor in our bond. Julianne had been planning this since the moment I walked out of the estate 6 months ago. She hadn't just been watching me. She had been digging into the roots of my life, looking for the one thing that could pull me back under. You're working for her? I asked, a fresh wave of nausea hitting me. After she kept you in the dark for 20 years, you're helping her destroy me. I'm helping myself, Ilara. Leo shouted, his voice cracking. I've been living in the vents and the sores while you've been eating off silver plates. She promised me a life. She promised me a name. All I have to do is sign a statement saying that Serafina kidnapped you from the ward. That the bond is a forced claim. That you're still property of the Thorn estate. The silence that followed was absolute. A forced claim was a capital crime in the council's eyes. It would strip Serafina of her assets, her title, and her freedom. It would destroy everything we had just fought for. Serafina moved then. Not toward Leo, but toward me. She took my face in her hands, her golden eyes searching mine with a terrifying intensity. Ilara, look at me. You are not a debt. You are not an investment. If you want to go with him, if you want to end this right now, I will let you. I will give him whatever he wants to keep you safe. No, I said, my voice finally finding its edge. I looked past her at the man who shared my eyes. You're not my brother, Leo. My brother died in that fire. He died protecting me. You're just a ghost Julianne Thorne is using to haunt a house she can't buy. I turned to the enforcers. Get him out. The recording hit the airwaves before the sun even touched the horizon. By 8 in the morning, the Sterling name was being dragged through the digital mud of every major news outlet in the city. The voice on the tape was mine, shaky, terrified, admitting to a past that sounded like a criminal indictment. They called it the Ward scandal. They called me a biological fugitive. And they called Serafina a predator who had hidden a stolen investment. Julianne Thorne had played her hand perfectly. She didn't wait for a council session. She went for the heart of the Sterling public image. I stood in the center of the library, watching the headlines flicker across the screens. The estate was under siege, the gates swarmed by reporters and protesters. The silence inside the house was no longer heavy with luxury. It was pressurized with the coming explosion. I'm so sorry, I whispered, my voice breaking as Serafina entered the room. I gave her exactly what she needed. I let my past destroy our future. Serafina didn't look like a woman who was losing her empire. She was dressed in a suit of pure white, her silver hair shimmering like a blade. She walked over to me, her golden eyes steady, her scent, cedarwood and rain, a calm, unyielding anchor. You didn't give her anything, Ilara, she said, taking my hands. You gave me the final piece of the puzzle. Julianne thinks she's exposing your debt. She doesn't realize she's exposing her own father's crimes. We aren't going to hide. We're going to the Sterling Plaza. We're going to finish this in the light. The ride to the plaza was a blur of flashing lights and shouting faces. When we stepped out of the SUV, the wall of noise was deafening. But as Serafina led me through the crowd, her hand firmly in mine, the noise started to shift. People saw the mark on my neck. They saw the way she looked at me, not as a pet, but as her equal. Julianne Thorne was waiting in the lobby, surrounded by the board of directors. She looked triumphant, a folder of legal documents in her hand. It's over, Serafina, Julianne said, her voice amplified by the acoustics of the grand hall. The records from the ward are clear. Ilara was property of Thorne Acquisitions. Your soul mark is a violation of international trade laws. Sign the transfer papers, and I might let the council be lenient with your sentence. I stepped forward before Serafina could speak. I felt the thrum of our bond, the absolute certainty of her support. I wasn't the girl who ran through the rain anymore. The records aren't clear, Julianne, I said, my voice echoing through the lobby, silencing the crowd. Because the ward wasn't a business. It was a human trafficking ring. And your father didn't just lose an investment when that building burned. He lost the evidence of 20 years of illegal omega harvesting. The room went cold. Julianne's smirk faltered. You're lying. You have no proof. I have the Guardian's records, I said, turning to the large screens in the lobby. With a gesture, the screens changed. They didn't show the news. They showed the internal ledgers of Thorne Acquisitions, files Serafina had spent the last 6 months quietly buying from disgruntled whistleblowers. Serafina didn't just fund the shelter to find me. She funded it to build a network of survivors. And every single woman at the Haven has a story that starts with your father's name. One by one, the faces of the women from the shelter appeared on the screens. Martha, Chloe, dozens of others. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were witnesses. The debt is paid, Julianne, I said, stepping into her space. It was paid in the blood of the children your father sold. And today, the interest is due. The enforcers didn't move for me this time. They moved for Julianne. The Council of Alphas, led by a pale Arthur Vance, stepped out of the elevator. They had seen the files. They had felt the soul mark. They knew that the storm was finally turning against the Thorne family. Julianne was led away in silence, her empire crumbling before she could even sign the papers. As the crowd dispersed, leaving only the quiet hum of the plaza, I turned to Serafina. The weight of 20 years felt like it had finally lifted. The rain had stopped. The sun was flooding the lobby, reflecting off the glass and gold. "It's done," I whispered. "It's just beginning," Serafina said, pulling me into a deep, lingering embrace. She kissed the mark on my neck, her scent enveloping me in a promise of a future that was no longer a cage. A year later, I stood on the balcony of the estate, looking out at the city. The skyline was the same, but the air felt different. It didn't taste like submission. It tasted like freedom. Serafina stepped up behind me, her arms wrapping around my waist. She was no longer just the alpha of the city. She was my mate. My partner. My home. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her voice a low, warm purr in my ear. "I was thinking about the first night at the shelter," I said. "How I hated the Guardian for saving me. And now." I turned in her arms, looking into those golden eyes that had hunted me, found me, and finally set me free. And now, I think the Guardian was the best thing that ever happened to me. Because she didn't just save my life. She gave me a reason to live it. I leaned up and kissed her, the sun rising over our city. The gilded debt was gone. The cage was broken. And for the first time in my life,